The sharp clang of metal against metal echoed through the dimly lit garage as 78-year-old Henry Grayson slammed his wrench down, his weathered hands trembling with a mix of exhaustion and determination. For decades, he'd been the heart of Grayson's auto shop, a small haven tucked away in the quiet outskirts of Boston, where the scent of oil and gasoline mingled with memories of a life spent fixing cars and fixing lives. But today was different. This wasn't just any repair job. The sleek, cherry-red 1962 Lincoln Continental sitting before him belonged to none other than Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man whose name carried the weight of history and hope. Henry had taken on the task with a quiet pride, knowing this car wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol, a piece of a legacy he'd admired since his youth when he'd watched JFK's inauguration on a crackling black and white TV. Now, with arthritis gnawing at his joints and his shop teetering on the edge of closure due to mounting debts, this job felt like a last stand. Henry's story wasn't one of glamour. A widower for 15 years, he'd raised his daughter, Emily, alone after his wife, Clara, passed from a sudden illness. Emily had grown into a brilliant engineer, now living in Seattle, but the distance between them had widened with time, leaving Henry with little more than his tools and the occasional call from her. The garage, once a bustling hub, had seen better days, fewer customers, rising costs, and a landlord threatening eviction if the rent wasn't paid by month's end. This repair job, arranged through a mutual acquaintance, was a lifeline. Kennedy's team had promised a generous fee, enough to keep the shop afloat for another few months, and Henry poured every ounce of his skill into it. He worked late into the night, his flashlight casting shadows over the engine as he meticulously replaced worn gaskets and tuned the carburetor, his mind drifting to the Kennedy family's resilience, how they'd faced tragedy after tragedy yet kept moving forward. It mirrored his own life, he thought, though he'd never admit it aloud. The challenge came midway through the week when Henry discovered a rare crack in the car's transmission housing, a flaw that could have been overlooked but would have spelled disaster on the road. His hands shook as he realized the part was no longer manufactured, and the cost of a custom replacement would eat into the already tight budget. Panic set in. He couldn't afford to lose this job, not when the bank was breathing down his neck. For a moment, he considered a quick fix, a patch that might hold for a while, but his integrity, honed by years of Clara's gentle reminders to do right, won out. He called Kennedy's assistant, his voice cracking as he explained the issue, half expecting to be fired on the spot. Instead, the assistant praised his honesty and promised to source the part, even offering to cover the extra cost. Relief flooded Henry, but it was tinged with exhaustion. He'd have to work even harder to meet the deadline. As the week drew to a close, Henry finished the repair, the Continental purring like a dream when he turned the key. He polished the hood until it gleamed, a tear escaping as he thought of Clara, who'd always believed in his craftsmanship. The next morning, he delivered the car to Kennedy's estate, a modest man in a worn cap accepting the keys with a grateful nod. Henry returned to his shop, the weight of survival lifting slightly, and began tallying the payment to stabilize his finances. But a week later, as he swept the garage floor, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up, squinting against the sunlight, and froze. There stood Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself, his tall frame filling the doorway, a look of shock etched across his face. Henry dropped the broom, his heart pounding. Kennedy stepped forward, his eyes wide as he scanned the cluttered space, the faded photos of Henry's family on the walls, the ancient radio crackling in the corner. "This is your shop?" Kennedy asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and awe. Henry nodded, unsure what to say. Kennedy explained that he'd come to thank the mechanic personally, having driven the car that morning and found it running better than it had in years. But it wasn't just the repair that stunned him. He'd noticed an old newspaper clipping tucked under the driver's seat, a yellowed article from 1963 about his uncle's assassination, with a handwritten note, "To Henry, for your honesty and heart, JFK." It was a memento Henry had kept from a brief encounter with the president during a campaign stop, a moment he'd forgotten he'd left behind. Tears welled in Kennedy's eyes as he held out the clipping. "You knew my uncle," he said softly. Henry's knees weakened as memories flooded back, shaking JFK's hand, promising to keep the faith, a promise he'd carried silently through decades of loss. The two men sat amidst the grease and tools, sharing stories, Henry of his struggles, Kennedy of his family's burdens. It was a raw, human connection, bridging generations and grief. Kennedy, moved by Henry's dedication and the clipping's serendipity, made a call right then, arranging for a foundation grant to save the garage and fund its restoration as a community hub. He also reached out to Emily, reuniting father and daughter over a tearful video call that afternoon. As Kennedy left, he clasped Henry's hand, promising to return. The shop, once a symbol of fading dreams, buzzed with new life in the weeks that followed, local kids learning mechanics, neighbors pitching in. Henry, reinvigorated, found purpose again, his bond with Emily strengthening with each call. The story spread, inspiring a community to rally around resilience and kindness. In the end, Henry learned that even in the darkest times, a single act of integrity could spark a chain of hope, proving that legacy isn't just inherited, it's built, one honest effort at a time.